This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, great.
The scholar Nicholas Page, discussing aesthetics and corporeality in 17th century France, observed that since Kant and Hegel, aesthetic appreciation, disinterested and spiritualized, has been construed as the very opposite of bodily experience. Art for the senses might as well be pornography. Over the past few years, I've been circling the topic of Mesopotamian aesthetics from diverse perspectives, as I've tackled theoretical concerns relating to the visual arts, materiality, the senses, and emotions. I'm interested here in taking up the idea of art for the senses, art intimately designed for and entangled with bodily, sensorial, and emotional experiences, as an entry point to the study of Mesopotamian art and aesthetics. In the coming discussion, I'll begin by confronting some of the problematic legacies of 18th and 19th century Europe, including the concepts of fine art and disinterested aesthetics for ancient and non-Western arts, categories that Mesopotamia at least partially occupies. I'll then take up a case study from Mesopotamia that I've found to be a particularly productive thought piece in my recent works. This is an Acrosis, a vivid written description of the divinely perfected body of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, derived from the Sumerian narrative Gilgamesh and Aga. The Acrosis offers us, or so I would argue, a vital glimpse into entangled issues of aesthetics, the senses, emotion, cognition, and into how the Mesopotamians themselves engaged a strikingly intimate, corporeal, and sophisticated engagement with masterworks and other aesthetic objects. There are a couple of terms and issues I want to clarify before we get into this. One is a distinction I want to draw in my use of the term object and thing. Here, and in much of my recent work, I've distinguished between the designation of artworks as our objects, which establishes them as belonging to and dependent on us, and upon the designation of artworks as things, which may not only be acted upon, but also may act in and on the world as agents in their own rights. The process of changing a thing into an object is one I'll touch briefly upon today. I also want to clarify my use of the terms ancient and non-Western, both generally and in relation to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is arguably both ancient and non-Western, though it is frequently situated as neither. The term ancient often continues to be used to refer exclusively to the Greco-Roman world, excluding the ancient Near East, and the term non-Western sits rather uneasily on Mesopotamia's co-opted shoulders. Mesopotamia, after all, was adopted, however contingently, into the Western story of art and history soon after its rediscovery in the mid-19th century. The term non-Western, moreover, is unquestionably problematic. It suggests a false homogeneity of the very diverse things subsumed within that category, even as it centers the idea of Western as the standard against which other things are judged, or judged wanting. I've addressed these issues elsewhere at greater length than I can do here, but I remain inclined to use these terms in the absence of better ones, provided we are cognizant of their shortcomings. The last point I want to highlight is that I discuss the categories of ancient and non-Western in conjunction repeatedly throughout this discussion. This is because Mesopotamia occupies, to some degree, both of these categories, not because the two are being equated. With that said, let's dive in. The modern system of the arts, rooted in 18th and 19th century Europe, idealizes fine art as an end in itself, something created by original and creative genius, and existing primarily to be looked at or read or listened to with an absorbed, exclusive, and disinterested attention. Arts created within this system, which the anthropologist Shelley Arrington characterized as art by intention, were designed to be displayed in museums and similar contexts where they could be properly viewed and appreciated. But this system also came to encompass, albeit not on their own terms, many ancient and non-Western and other things that were never intended to be art as such. Such things were assimilated through diverse means and ultimately reduced to objects, suitably neutered, that might be displayed within institutional contexts like museums and galleries, and viewed there with distanced and disinterested attention. Arrington characterized this latter category of things as art by appropriation, highlighting the fact that many of the non-Western and ancient things so assimilated were never intended as passive objects to be distantly viewed. Their recontextualization as such often led to their significant material and other alteration, and negated their original roles as agents acting in and on the world. Among the diverse changes that ancient and non-Western things have frequently undergone in the process of their objectification as Western-style art objects are physical metamorphoses, transformations in state and transfictions of time and motion, and alterations in context and frame. Physical changes inflicted on ancient and non-Western things to heighten their capacity to serve as collectible and display-worthy art objects include fragmentation, or even more violent amputation, of the type undertaken by 1920s art dealers of African things, who stripped the latter's soft and fibrous parts, rendering them starkly modern looking and preserving or creating a particular aesthetic. The addition of material, as on restored or even deliberately hybridized Greek and Roman works, which might incorporate parts from different sculptures, and the alteration of material properties to lengthen a work's lifespan, as through the gluing to canvas of once deliberately ephemeral Navajo sand paintings to create Western-style paintings. In their relationships to time and motion, ancient and non-Western things may also be prevented from displaying damage, decay, or visible traces of refurbishment, or materially altered to preserve an apparently changeless or restored form. And they are also frequently decontextualized, alienated from contexts in which they may have formed part of larger wholes, as well as recontextualized, often in the form of isolated and autonomous objects in very different types of physical and psychological space, as in carefully designed and curated museums and galleries. Once immobilized in institutions, the types of interaction and engagement available with such things are typically very limited. They are available for viewing. This is a significant limitation of the diverse types of multisensorial engagement that may have been available in the original cultural contexts of many of these things. Viewing is also a peculiarly and deliberately distanced form of engagement. Isaac Asimov, the brilliant writer of speculative fiction, drew a compelling distinction between viewing, a detached, unidirectional, and long-distance act, and seeing, a mutual and interactive engagement replete with rich sensual and material possibilities in his 1957 novel, The Naked Sun. Two of the passages from his novel are particularly telling. You're viewing me right now. You can't touch me, can you? Or smell me, or anything like that. You could if you were seeing me. Right now, I'm 200 miles away from you at least. So how can it, referring to viewing and seeing, be the same thing? Bailey grew interested. But I see you with my eyes. No, you don't see me. You see my image. You're viewing me. This is not to diminish or underestimate the seductiveness of the active viewing, the potency of the imagined access granted to the person or thing viewed was indeed one of the central conceits of Asimov's novel. But Asimov also recognized and explicitly asserted the limitations of viewing as a substitute for seeing, highlighting the latter's material and multisensorial possibilities for interaction. He says, without the interplay of human against human, the chief interest in life is gone. Most of the intellectual values are gone. Most of the reason for living is gone. Viewing is no substitute for seeing. Viewing is a long-distance sense. I would argue that this is as true for our engagement with things as it is for our engagement with persons. It is interesting, in light of this elucidation, to discover that it is precisely because of its capacity for remote and distance sensing that the eye and viewing, and to a lesser extent the ear and hearing, is the most highly valued in some of the most seminal works of Western aesthetics. As interesting is the degree to which the distanced eye continues to dominate our engagement with institutionalized art. Even when one has the capacity to closely approach objects in museum and gallery contexts, engagement is deliberately distanced in other ways, as by placing things behind glass or forbidding their touch. Distanced and disinterested viewing is permissible. Other types of physical and sensorial encounter are not. But how and why did the distant and disinterested eye gain its central place in Western approaches to art and aesthetics? To answer this question, we must look to key developments in Western aesthetics in 18th and 19th century Europe, the same period in which public art museums came to prominence. The establishment of aesthetics as a significant Western philosophical discipline occurred alongside the rise of the modern system of the arts. The discipline's naming in 1735 by the German philosopher Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten has often been characterized as an adult baptism in recognition of the fact that vigorous aesthetic discourse in practice goes back at least as far as the ancient world, to Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Poetics. Writing in his Aesthetica, Baumgarten defined aesthetics as 1, the science of sensuous cognition, which ought to be utilized to establish 2, a theory of art. But what exactly should we understand by the term sensuous cognition within its original framework and otherwise? As a starting point, it's worth highlighting that Baumgarten's work laid new emphasis on the cognitive value of the senses, challenging the Enlightenment era suspicion and denigration of the senses prevalent at the time. This is not to say that Baumgarten's emphasis on the senses was totally unprecedented. In 17th century France, for example, aesthetic formulations of taste frequently allied it with corporeality and sensibility, offering an embodied experience of taste. The sense of beauty and propriety that taste afforded, far from surpassing sensuous experience, was firmly rooted in it. Then too, if it was Baumgarten who named the philosophical discipline of aesthetics, it was Immanuel Kant who established its significance in his critique of judgment, and who shaped in numerous significant ways the future directions of the discipline. Kant, it is interesting to note, also published an assessment of the 5 corporeal senses in his 1798 Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, dividing the senses on cognitive grounds. He ranked sight, hearing, and touch as higher senses, characterizing them as objective and as contributing more to the cognition of the external object than they stir up the consciousness of the affected organ. Of these 3, moreover, sight was deemed the noblest. It not only has the widest sphere of perception in space, but also its organ feels least affected. Thus, sight comes nearer to being a pure intuition, the immediate representation of the given object, without admixture of noticeable sensation. Now, taste and smell, in contrast, were deemed lower, subjective senses, contributing more a representation of enjoyment than of cognition of the external object. These senses were further diminished as being merely of organic sensation, like so many external entrances prepared by nature, so that the animal can distinguish objects. This privileging of the cognitive and of the spiritual, and the concomitant diminution of the corporeal and of sensation itself, is evident throughout much of Kant's aesthetics. Kant, moreover, regarded aesthetic pleasure, the pleasure we take in beauty, whether in art or nature, as unrelated to insight and cognition. He contrasted the universal judgment of taste and the beautiful with mere corporeal sensibility and the aesthetic body that supply the gratification and enjoyment of the agreeable. He also distinguished aesthetic pleasure, here more specifically, from 2 other types of pleasure: the pleasure of the agreeable and the pleasure we take in the good. These latter 2 are characterized by what we might call interested interest in the existence of their object. Pleasure in the agreeable is associated with a strong interest in the existence of the object because one intends to use the object to satiate one's own desires. Pleasure in the good is arguably similarly interest in the existence of the object, because one cannot imagine something good without desiring that it exists. So in neither of these cases is the object an end in itself. In both cases, it's an end associated with one's own desires. In contrast to these, aesthetic pleasure was characterized by disinterested interest, an absence of desire for the existence of the object, which is thought to serve no purpose, being rather an end in itself. Here, the pleasure of beauty is thought to free us from all such longings and strivings. Aesthetic pleasure, in other words, was severed from base human appetites and desires, as well as dissociated from mere agreeable sensation. Instead, it was thought to ennoble the mind and to elevate above the mere receptivity to pleasure from sense perceptions. In the later 19th and 20th centuries, this peculiar idea of disinterested interest was bound up in conceptualizations of an aesthetic attitude. The aesthetic attitude might be defined as a psychologically distinctive state of distanced contemplation. This denotes the particular state of mind one adopts when contemplating an art or aesthetic object, a state of mind unmotivated by self-interest, appetites, or desires. The object of one's disinterested interest is neither instrumental nor an object of longing. Instead, it is an end in itself. Viewers in this scenario are distanced from their base appetites and corporeality, while the things regarded are stripped of agency and function. They exist to be contemplated as objects, and their diminution is only imperfectly masked by the idea that this is for their own sakes. The introduction of the concept of disinterestedness into modern moral and aesthetic discourses is notably attributed to the works of Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. It is interesting to briefly examine the milieu in which he was operating. Interest in the early 18th century was closely associated with the possession of wealth, as well as the types of mercenary and motivated self-love that might, at the extreme, lead to avarice. Disinterested action, in contrast, was action absent a regard for one's personal benefit, whether in this world or any other. Within the sphere of religion, Shaftesbury characterized disinterestedness as teaching the love of God or virtue for God or virtue's sake, absent any servile or mercenary motive. Elsewhere, in a discussion of nature, Shaftesbury rejected covetous fancy, instead advocating for a type of pure contemplation of nature, a non-mercenary love. He drew a distinction, in other words, between the sensually gratifying desire to possess and the non-sensuous and rational appreciation of beauty. The capacity to demonstrate the latter would come to be regarded as a defining feature of human beings. This is in contrast to the appetites and instincts regarded as driving non-human animals. The religious aspects of disinterested interest, as they emerge in Shaftesbury's work, are clearly intimated here. Of course, the foundations of Western aesthetics are by no means limited to the contributions I've so briefly considered here, but this discussion highlights the degree to which aesthetics, the so-called science of sensuous cognition, simultaneously foregrounded some of the senses, like sight, in some ways, with an emphasis on distanced viewing, while derogating other sensory and corporeal experiences like interest, feeling, passion, intimacy, and desire. It also unveils some of the quite culturally and temporally specific social and religious developments that impelled this diminution. What is interesting is the degree to which many of these ideas continue to pervade our contemporary Western engagement with art, as well as our broader understanding of aesthetics in relation to the body and the senses, which have often left us to equate art for the senses, as Page observed, with little more than pornography. This is particularly problematic for ancient and non-Western aesthetics, which have no reason to share this, in context, very peculiar denigration of the senses, of intimacy, and of corporeality. Significant pushback against the tenets of Western philosophical aesthetics, indeed, have come from anthropologists, particularly those engaged in the anthropology of aesthetics. It has also come, interestingly, from within, as by the works of the English painter and critic William Hogarth, whose 1753 volume, The Analysis of Beauty, challenged ideas like that of disinterested interest, which would ultimately come to dominate Western philosophical aesthetics, in favor of an unabashedly sensual and embodied aesthetics. In a cheeky tweet of the lofty and purportedly disinterested philosophical sensibilities demanded by dominant works of aesthetics, Hogarth demanded, "Who but a bigot, even to the antiques, will say that he has not seen faces and necks, hands and arms in living women that even the Grecian Venus doth coarsely imitate?" Hogarth's work is notable for its highlighting not only of diverse aspects of actual human bodies, not idealized ones, but also of everyday things like corsets and candle holders. His privileging of the actual human body as a key site for the communication of meaning is reflected also in his prints and paintings, in which the human body functions variously as bearer of aesthetic and erotic expression and desire, as iconic reference to individuals, and as articulation of diverse sexual, social, and cultural identities. Such representations directly challenged prevailing aesthetic thought in their assertion that the perception of beauty not only resided in mundane, again, not idealized bodies and things, but also was directly accessible to the ordinary, untrained eye. Hogarth's aesthetics, regrettably, were rapidly marginalized, but they are notable for revealing, already in the mid-18th century, the constructed and contingent nature of key tenets of Western philosophical aesthetics. They also force us to confront our own culturally inculcated discomfort with sensuality and corporeality, a crucial step before engaging with Mesopotamian aesthetics, within the framework of which things like the sensual and even explicitly sexualized royal body may represent wholly legitimate, pleasing, and significant objects of aesthetic attention. As we turn now to the concluding section of this discussion, I want to take up a case study that has been of particular interest in my recent work on aesthetics, the senses, and emotions. This centers on an Acrosis, a brilliantly vivid word picture of the body of Gilgamesh, a legendary king of Uruk and Mesopotamian culture hero, as he is described in the early 2nd millennium BCE Sumerian narrative, Gilgamesh and Aga. The royal body in Mesopotamian literary and other texts is revealed as an aesthetic object or masterwork, even a made thing, as the king is described in various periods and contexts as physically and otherwise shaped or perfected by the gods. In the late 2nd millennium standard Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, for example, it is said of Gilgamesh that Gilgamesh was his name from the day he was born, 2/3 of him God, but 1/3 of him human. Beilit Ili drew the shape of his body. Nudimid brought his form to perfection. What is of particular interest to me in Gilgamesh and Aga is the way in which the royal body's significant aesthetic and affective properties are deliberately exploited to wage psychological warfare against the enemies of Uruk. The Acrosis, in other words, offers us a vital glimpse into entangled issues of aesthetics, the senses, emotions, and cognition, and gives us an idea of how the Mesopotamians themselves understood and deployed these. At its most basic level, we might characterize ekphrasis as a written description of a work of visual art. But conceptions of ekphrasis have been significantly expanded and nuanced in recent decades, with an emphasis on the sophistication of their interplay of verbal with visual representation. A more pertinent definition for our purposes may characterize ekphrosis as speech that brings the subject matter vividly before the eyes and creates an emotional effect in the audience's imagination. To the study of aesthetics, the senses, and emotions, ekphrosis has the potential to offer, even at its most visual, when words grope to represent images, evocative resonances of the other senses, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The referent in an ekphrastic account, unlike a stilled, decontextualized, institutionalized visual art object, has the capacity to reveal something of its movement, agency, effects, and interactions. Let's turn now to the specific passage of interest in Gilgamesh and Aga. Gilgamesh and Aga is one of 5 Sumerian narratives extant from the Old Babylonian period, concerned with recounting the extraordinary exploits of Gilgamesh, legendary ruler of the city of Uruk. The other 4 narratives are listed on the screen. Gilgamesh and Aga specifically describes a conflict between 2 ancient cities, Kish and Uruk, and their respective kings, Aga and Gilgamesh. Unlike some of the other Sumerian Gilgamesh narratives, Gilgamesh and Aga does not deal with mythological content. There are no gods or monsters or adventures in strange lands here. Instead, it has often been seen as a comparatively straightforward political and battle narrative, at least to the degree that any Sumerian composition might be characterized as straightforward. I want to reconsider this view of the composition here through an exploration of the ekphrosis of Gilgamesh and its role in the narrative action. But before we get there, some contextualization of the narrative itself is in order. Gilgamesh and Aga opens with the dispatch of envoys from Aga, king of the powerful city of Kish, to Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. Aga demands that Uruk submit to Kish, a submission that appears to entail that Uruk's inhabitants will supply servile labor to Kish. Gilgamesh, as we soon discover, perhaps unsurprisingly given his character, is not remotely interested in such submission. He presents Aga's demands to the elders of Uruk, even as he exhorts them to support battle instead. The elders, cautious, likely overly so, and unwilling or unable to face the harsh rigors of war, advise Gilgamesh to accede to Aga's demands. But Gilgamesh, youthful and vigorous, rejects this counsel. Instead, he seeks out and he finds like-minded young men who will fight Kish alongside him rather than submit. The young men of Uruk plan for battle as Aga's forces march towards and ultimately besiege their city. At this critical juncture, as Uruk is under siege by a presumably superior and dangerous force, Gilgamesh evolves a crafty scheme. As he gathers his warriors and issues instructions, the outlines of Gilgamesh's plan slowly become evident. He intends to sow fear and confusion among the enemy forces of Kish by deploying psychological and aesthetic warfare, as well as force of arms. Gilgamesh begins by enlisting an intrepid volunteer, a royal guard named Bir-Hatura, to go forth from Uruk into the midst of the besieging forces. Bir-Hatura's fate is unavoidably grim. He faces inevitable capture and abuse by the enemy. But it is also critical to Gilgamesh's plan. Bir-Hatura will certainly suffer among the enemy soldiers, but he will also be brought into the presence of their king, Aga, at two crucial psychological moments. The first phase of Gilgamesh's plan proceeds apace. Bir-Hatura sallies forth from the city gate. He is caught by the soldiers of Kish. He is beaten for his trouble, and he is taken before Aga. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, back inside the walls of Uruk, implements the second phase of his plan. An anonymous official climbs the city's ramparts and deliberately draws Aga's eye. Now Aga, outside the walls, demands of the captured Bir-Hatura, "Slave, is that man not your king?" Bir-Hatura responds derisively, "That man is not my king," before he launches into an extraordinarily and remarkably vivid ekphrastic account of the affective body of Gilgamesh, an account that serves to bring Gilgamesh vividly before the eyes of the enemy. "Were that man my king, were that his fearsome brow, were those his bison eyes, were that his beard of lapis lazuli, were those his fingers fine, would a myriad not fall, a myriad not rise? Would a myriad thereby not roll in the dust? Would all the nations thereby not be overwhelmed? Would the mouths of the land thereby not be filled with dust? Would he not cut down the horns of the boat? Would he not make Aga, king of Kish, a prisoner in the heart of his army?" Bir-Hatura's vivid and dramatic and ominous representation of Gilgamesh is critical to the narrative action. It is the point, indeed, on which the action turns. It works on multiple levels on the narrative's internal and external audiences. First, it evokes, before Gilgamesh's actual appearance before the forces of Kish, the potent physical, sensorial, emotional, and aesthetic appeal of his extraordinary body, as well as of its affective power. And it does not yet even mention Gilgamesh's melam, the type of awe-inspiring aura possessed by gods, kings, and various extraordinary things like temples and cult objects, as well as by Gilgamesh, which is capable of eliciting physical, sensorial, cognitive, and emotional effects in its beholders. What Bir-Hatura says is that had Gilgamesh appeared on Uruk's ramparts, both Aga and we would already know. The physical and psychological effects on the forces of Kish and on us would leave no one in doubt. The soldiers of Kish would have fallen, rolled in the dust, been utterly overwhelmed, and Aga himself would have been seized as prisoner. In response to all this, Bir-Hatura is now beaten a second time for his insolence. But now Uruk's own forces begin to mobilize. Gilgamesh himself now climbs upon the wall, and his melam, the awe-inspiring splendor possessed by his extraordinary body, envelops his own people, young and old. It appears to invigorate the able-bodied men who seize their weapons, as Enkidu, Gilgamesh's companion, goes fearlessly forth from Uruk's gates to meet the enemy. And Gilgamesh himself, standing on Uruk's rampart, raises his head. Now it is Kish's turn. Aga catches sight of Gilgamesh, and it is now that Bir-Hatura fulfills his second critical task, as Aga asks of him, this time one might imagine in trepidation or in terror, "Slave, is that man your king?" And Bir-Hatura asserts, perhaps triumphantly, "That man is indeed my king." And now at last, bolstered by the psychological ploy of the decoy and by the dread that has had time to build among the enemy following Bir-Hatura's vivid representation, Gilgamesh's body asserts its full effects. The enemy soldiers of Kish are cast down into the dust, and Aga himself is taken prisoner in the midst of his own army. Gilgamesh's battle strategy overall in Gilgamesh and Aga reflects a nuanced grasp of the psychological effects of ekphrosis, as well as of the aesthetic and affective properties of Gilgamesh's own extraordinary body and melam. Mesopotamia did not record such explicitly reflective philosophical discourses on aesthetics or on the body and the senses as survived from 18th and 19th century Europe, or even from ancient Greece. But this is not evidence of a failure to reflect. The ekphrosis in Gilgamesh and Aga indeed reveals the existence not only of a complex embodied and sensual aesthetics, but also, and perhaps even more critically, of a sophisticated understanding of its cognitive and physical implications. It highlights, too, the intimate proximity of the thing viewed to the viewer in Mesopotamia, whether the former is a masterwork of art, a divinely perfected royal body, a temple, a cult statue presencing a god. Distanced or disinterested viewing has no place here. Instead, the senses, emotions, judgment, cognition, bodily effects, and affects all are tightly entangled here. The act of intense looking at a person or thing, combined with one's positive assessment of that thing, may evoke potent emotional and physical experiences in one's own person. Similarly, if one chooses to look at another person or thing, one may be rendered defenseless against its aesthetic, affective, and other potent attributes. In Gilgamesh and Aga, the forces of Kish lay themselves open to Gilgamesh's aesthetic and affective power, that of his extraordinary body plus his melam, merely by looking upon him. The resulting experience is physically, sensorially, and emotionally devastating. A myriad did fall, a myriad did rise, a myriad did thereby roll in the dust. All the nations were thereby overwhelmed. The mouths of the land were thereby filled with dust. He cut down the horns of the boat. In the midst of his army, he, meaning Gilgamesh, took prisoner Aga, king of Kish. Thank you.